Hi everyone, so my name's Jason Ager and I'm the guy behind Ascend Labs and behind Force Hooks as well. So if you've ever interacted with us on social media like Instagram, I'm almost certainly the guy behind the screen. But today isn't about me, it's about the interview that I did with Danny Lum, the head S&C at Singapore Sport, when I was in Singapore towards the end of last year. Danny was really generous with his time, and I think he has so much information to share, and so much like experience implementing these things in a real world setting, like within a true high performance sport program. And so, without further ado, here's the interview with Danny Lum, head of strength and conditioning at Singapore Sport. What's your name, and can you tell us a little bit about your background?
My name is Danny Lam. So I'm the team lead, head of strength conditioning at Singapore Sports Institute. My bachelor degree was in health and sports exercise science from UWA. I did my master's and PhD back in Singapore at Nanyang Technological University. So my PhD was on isometric strength training for sports performance. Yeah.
Okay, and what kind of studies did you do as part of that PhD?
So I had three studies. First was to look at different loading strategies for isometric training, which would give us the best optimum effect, whether it's a ballistic contraction with no sustained contraction or a ballistic contraction with sustained contraction. And then after that, I looked at isometric strength training for spring carcass, and I also look at compared isometric strength training with plyometric training for endurance running. And along the way, I also conducted research to look at how measures obtained from isometric tests correlates with different sports performance.
And were you interested in isometrics before you started your PhD? And were you implementing them before, or did that kind of start during the PhD and afterwards?
I started getting interested in isometric training when I started training our judo athletes, because judo involves quite a fair bit of isometric contraction during the fight. Yeah. So I included isometric training for our judo athletes, and it showed some positive effect. Like most of them got pretty strong, not just in the gym, but during the fights, they can actually hold their grip better and not get moved around by the opponent. Yeah. And because of that, I started including isometric training into other athletes' program as well, like our swimmers back in 2017, yeah, 2016, 2017,
Yeah.
around there. Yeah. And it worked well for them as well. Part of their improved performance, I would say, may be attributed to isometric training. And because of that, I wanted to find out more about isometric training. I looked into the literature. There were very little about isometric training and sports performance. And most of the studies on isometric training were single joint isometric exercises, leg extension, elbow flexion. Very limited number of exercise studies that actually look at multi-joint isometric training effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was why during my PhD, I chose to look at how isometric training may affect sports performance. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you've been doing isometrics now for quite a number of years, so about five years, or even a bit longer.
If we include the time when I wasn't doing my studies, then yeah, a little longer, maybe about seven years now. Yeah.
Okay, do you have any, so after using them for so long in like a sport context, do you have any tips for like a coach who maybe has heard about isometrics and wants to implement them? Do you have any kind of nuggets of wisdom or kind of tips you've picked up along the way that really stand out?
I've talked to many people about isometric training. Like people approach me about it as well, and actually everyone use isometric training in different form, different loading strategy. Most of the people I know, I've talked to, have been using the whole isometric training. So we categorize isometric training into hold and push. So what I researched on was the push method, whereby we exert force against something that we can't move. But many people I talked to have been using the whole isometric, which is resisting a specific force. So for example, I do a back squat and then I hold that position, that sticking point position, for example. Yeah. Yeah, so many people do that, and you can look into Carl Diaz's triphasic training. He includes isometric training as a whole isometric training as well. Yeah. So when it comes to isometric training, it's pretty much the consideration for it is the same as how we used to do dynamic training. So what is your objective for including that isometric training? Is it to look at improving rate of force development? Is it to help to increase time under tension for hypertrophy effect? Yeah, so these are the considerations we always have to look at. So if we are trying to increase hypertrophy, then probably include the whole isometric training, whereby we can sustain position for a longer period of time. And if we are looking at increasing rate of force development, maximum strength, then I would say use the push method, because you can contract your muscle holistically. Yeah. So, and that is how we can improve the rate of force development.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So you said your PhD focused a lot more on the push isometrics than the hold isometrics.
Yeah.
Do you think are they kind of complementary, or is there a specific time when you'd want to use one versus the other?
Yeah. So to begin with, what I always recommend is not to use isometric as a standalone training, because we know dynamic training it is ultimately still better when in terms of adaptations for dynamic performance. But what I would say is using isometric training as a tool to enhance the overall effect, because we also know that isometric training is best at improving specific joint position force development. Yeah. So if I want to improve my squat, for example, I'm always going to be limited by how much force I can produce at the sticking region, right? So including isometric training at position close to the sticking point would benefit a lot. And in terms of when to use the hold, when to use the push, like I mentioned, if the objective is to increase time under tension, and also I don't want to have to load up another equipment or something like that, I would use the hold. So at the probably the final repetition of my dynamic squat, I hold the position at maybe the parallel position or knee at 90-degree position, and that helps me to increase my time under tension, which can have positive effect on hypertrophy. Yeah. And if I'm looking at maximum strength, rate of force development again, I'll go back to the push isometric training because that's when I can contract my muscle rapidly, yeah, and exert maximal amount of force because I can't move the bar. Yeah.
Yep. That really makes sense. And would you say that the push isometrics create a larger stimulus than the hold isometrics because of that higher force development? Or kind of how do you see them kind of impacting like fatigue and performance?
Okay.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the case. Recently, it depends on the intensity if we are talking about, because if we talk about trying to have maximum voluntary contraction, it's unlikely for us to do that with the whole isometric training. Yeah. So so the push isometric, we will be able to perform maximum voluntary contraction. But in one of our recent preliminary studies, we actually found that if we equate the volume and intensity, the whole isometric training might improve morphological adaptations slightly better, meaning getting a little more hypertrophic effect. Yeah. While the push isometric training might be better in terms of strength adaptations, probably more neurological adaptations from the push, while morphological adaptation from the hold. But our sample size was small, so we need to do more studies with larger sample size before we can have a more concrete conclusion on that. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Like when you say, no, it's a really interesting distinction, like the morphological and neurological.
Yeah.
And when you say you equated the intensities, how did you go about doing that?
So we use a biodex, and we got them to do leg extension, maximal voluntary contraction, and after that, what we did was both the hold and push condition, they had to exert 70% of MVC, and for 20 seconds, and for they did the training twice a week for about 6 weeks. Yeah, and each session they did 4 to 6 repetition of 20 seconds at 70% MVC, either hold or push. Yeah.
Okay, so you're equating the MVC, like percentage of MVC. Oh, interesting. So that was a leg extension.
Leg extension. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I like that. That's really fun. Seeing as you're kind of at one of the people at the forefront of isometrics, and kind of especially incorporating like multi-joint isometrics for like sport performance, do you have a sense of where you think the industry is heading? So I'm looking forward to the next 2 to 5 years. How do you think that isometrics and different types of isometric training will kind of fit into like the high performance training kind of world?
Okay, so we can see from the trend now that there's a lot more awareness on isometric training. I mean, there are a lot of people who have been doing it, but because nowadays there are more research coming out, more information coming out, and more talks on isometric training, more people are using it. And recently I've met people who have been promoting isometric tests. I've also met someone who has been promoting isometric training a lot. He actually came up with a device specially for isometric training. So I believe many people will start to look at how we can include isometric training into the overall program for our athletes. There are things that we can investigate further, like the fatigue effect of isometric training. How long does it take for athletes to recover from isometric training as compared to dynamic training? And because in that case, if one induces requires less recovery time, then coaches will probably use that particular method at certain period where we want to ensure that athletes are not getting overly fatigued while there's still some form of adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you kind of see it as being another tool in the toolbox, so they kind of use it with precision.
Yeah.
Once there's a bit more clarity and understanding about the exact effects and mechanisms.
Yeah. And because isometric training does not involve any movement, so the chances of getting injured is less. So this again provide some considerations for coaches when they plan the program again. Like, I'm very close to competition. I don't want my athletes to increase the risk of injury. Then I know isometric training can still work. All right, might as well.
Yeah.
So these are some of the consideration that for coaches, when they plan the program.
Yeah. Would you say that's how you've personally used it with your athletes a lot?
Yeah. For me, because recently we did publish a study to show that for as long as a 6 months period, including isometric training as part of the overall program, is still more beneficial than not including it. So what I have been doing is throughout the training macro cycle, actually, I would include some form of isometric training for the athletes. Yeah. Like I mentioned, usually in the general strength phase, I would use the whole isometric training for the purpose of increasing time under tension, and later in the phase, max strength, max power, to work on rate of force development with lower risk of injury, things like that. Yeah.
So the way you periodize the isometrics, you tend to kind of select the type of isometrics that is complementary, like targeting the same qualities as the thing you're doing, or do you tend to try target a different quality? Like, so rather, if it's in a hypertrophy block, like the higher time under tension for the holds, or would there be a benefit to having the rate of force development push isometrics in there? Like, kind of how do you see that kind of balance of like complementary versus balancing, I suppose?
Usually, at the moment, most of the time, I would be doing it in a complementary sense. Yeah. Yeah. And occasionally, I would still try to have a little bit of balance. It really depends on situation. Yeah.
I like that. It's nice. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I guess circling back to kind of what you use with your athletes, like, do you have a few tests or positions that are your kind of go-to positions in your isometric testing battery, or do you apply specific positions to the different sports?
When it comes to testing, we use general. We do it in a general way. Like most of the time, the most standard one we use is actually isometric mid-thigh. Yeah. So that, because it's easy for us to get into that position, and we don't have to move things around. it's a fast way to get the strength data out of athletes. Yeah.
And do you have any other tests that you commonly use?
We do isometric squat, we do isometric bench press, and isometric bench pull as well. So for example, I have a para shot put athlete. We use the isometric bench press to monitor his strength development. Yeah. Yeah. So for my carcass, we do isometric bench pull and isometric bench press as well. Yeah.
And what height, do you look for a certain height off the chest for the bench pull and bench press, or are you looking at elbow angles with those?
So for bench press, I would do it at for both actually 120-degree and 90-degree elbow angle.
Oh, so two different positions. Yeah. Do you find that like what's the rationale for the two different positions?
Okay, 90-degree for bench pull, for example, 120-degree is close to where the concentric force is initiated. Yeah, and then 90-degree is close to where the sticking point is. Yeah, and based on one of my study, we actually found that when I get the data from this both angle, peak force obtained from these two elbow angles for bench pull, we can actually predict the 1 RM bench pull with about 3% error. Yeah, yeah, within 3%. Yeah, but if we separate, like if I only use 120-degree or I only use 90-degree elbow angle, then error will be a little larger. Yeah.
Interesting. And do you find that, so I guess especially for say like the bench press, like that 90 degrees is like a relatively long muscle length. Do you find that that longer position is more sensitive to the changes in strength, or are they both kind of similar? Like you said, like you need both to predict change of strength, or is kind of one measure more sensitive or less sensitive, or?
So far, no. The change is quite similar. Yeah. Change in, but the larger angle, more extended elbow tend to have higher reliability especially when we look at early force development or rate of force development. Yeah. But when it comes to peak force, it's quite similar.
In terms of the reliability?
In terms of reliability, yeah.
Okay, so it's more reliable out here.
Yeah. So there's more variable. It's more variable when we are at a more stretched position. Yeah. That's from what I've observed with testing my athletes so far.
Yeah. Do you have any like what's the feedback like from the athletes when you start doing these tests? Like do some of them feel comfortable, or are they kind of pull up sore, or kind of what's the kind of your experience from implementing the upper body isometrics?
Some of them don't like it because it feels uncomfortable for them at the beginning, and because it's a lot of blood rush to the brain. Yeah, but they do see the advantage of it. Like they don't have to spend a lot of time doing the test. Like a 1 RM session for just one exercise can take up to half an hour or so. Yeah, but they see that after the isometric test, even though they exerted maximal effort, they can continue on with the training with minimal disruption or minimal. Yeah. So it's not like after the 1 RM test they won't be able to do the squats anymore, but after the isometric test they can continue with the squats. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So what are the... Do you plan on continuing more research into isometrics into the future?
Yes, I still have a few isometric training studies in mind. Yeah, so looking at how isometric contraction can help with the post-activation performance enhancements. That's one of them. Yeah. Yeah. So this is one of the things I'm looking at, and if I have the opportunity, I want to continue with the whole and push isometric as well, because
Seeing the differences.
yeah,
there.
because the preliminary study I mentioned, sample size is really small. It's very hard for us to give a concrete conclusion to that. Yeah.
Very interesting. And do you have any like specific, like what's your like, you know, your ideal world? Like do you have a clear kind of studies that you'd really like to see done, whether by yourself or by the rest of the community?
Well, I would say, especially when it comes to training intervention study, I would really like to look at a long term intervention, like because a lot of time when we do training study is short, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and it's really hard to tell whether it's the training is really that effective. I was happy that we managed to do a 24-week one, and that was that one time. I can understand because I've done it. I can understand how hard it is to actually do it. But if we can have such studies, more of such studies going on, yeah, it'll be great. Like it'll help us improve our knowledge on different training methods even better. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think like that long term piece and like long term with
Yeah.
you know people who are already strong and people who are already training and adding in as like an adjunct as instead of a replacement. I think that would be, I think like you said, like really fill some gaps in our understanding of like what exactly, like what the adaptations and the mechanisms.
Yeah, and another thing I also want to look at is this is gonna be even harder, like comparing different training methods for injury rehabilitation. Yeah, because like it's really hard for us to get a large group of people with the same injury doing different training at one time. But yeah, if we can actually go about doing that, maybe over many years, once we see someone injured, try to recruit the person. Yeah, yeah, I think that would be great as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that we can have better information on how to best provide rehab training for our athletes. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that segues into kind of another aspect that I wanted to ask you about is kind of a lot of your research has been working with healthy populations, improving performance.
Yep.
But do you think a lot of that can be translated to like rehab, and I guess like it'd be like later stage rehab, or how do you kind of see it fitting in with there?
Okay. So isometric training has always been part of rehabilitation. I mean, like if you look at an athlete who's injured, the first thing that physios always recommend is isometric contraction. Yeah. So there definitely there is that it's possible for what I've done to be used in the rehab setting as well, even during the early stage of rehab. But it really depends on the severity of the injury. Yeah. Like recently, I've read about someone looking at getting injured athletes with hamstring injury, doing assisted Nordic curl, like pretty much a few days after the person got injured, pretty much immediately after the person got injured. So it makes me think that have we been too conservative in that sense? Yeah. So yeah. So these are something that I myself don't have very good understanding on. Yeah, which I hope to work on that as well.
Yeah, and I guess like from my own personal interest, I think, do you think there's anything interesting there to kind of pass out in the late stage of rehab or in mid to late stage rehab where their strength is improving, but their rate of force development might be different? Is that something that you'd be looking at, and like what specifically would you be looking at?
I think one of the things we might not be investigating enough is the attribution of the improvement to whether more towards morphological adaptation or neurological adaptation. Yeah. So I believe neurological adaptation is very fast. It takes place very quickly. But for the tissue, muscle tissue, the tendon tissue to actually adapt, grow, get into hypertrophy, and so on, it takes a longer period of time. Yeah, and very often when we do research, we might not be separating, we might not be investigating these two forms of adaptation specifically. Yeah, so something we can think about when we do our research. Yeah, to specifically measure whether the adaptation is due to neural adaptation or whether it's due to morphological adaptation, and which one provides more contribution and so on. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the time required for each to take place. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you think isometrics can be used as both training and a testing tool to help pass that difference out?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. So with more equipment available, especially nowadays, we might not be using force plate, but we can actually get a cheaper equipment like strain gauges to measure the force while performing isometric exercise. We can actually use the data from the test itself to prescribe the training load, because now we can have a live feedback when we perform isometric training. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I think I remember seeing an article posted on Twitter about the late stage rehab for hamstring injury or ACL, and the peak force was roughly equivalent, but the rate of force development in the injured side or the side that they got the graft from, it may have been, I can't quite remember, I think it might be the side they got the graft from, was significantly reduced, even though the peak force was similar. And do you think like that's an area that could benefit? And kind of like if you were looking at a athlete with a history of, say, hamstring injury or ACL, do you have any specific measures that you look at, like a specific time window or metric for the rate of force development, or like how would you go about trying to pass out that difference of the morphological and neurological differences?
Well, this, honestly speaking, I'm not very knowledgeable in this area. Like, I'm not so knowledgeable in measuring morphological adaptations in terms of using the ultrasound scans and MRI kind of things. This is something I'm still trying to improve on. Yep. Yeah. So I think what we can do is we get the data out. Like you said, compare both, right? No change in peak force, and then what we can do next is actually to do the scan and see if there's any difference in terms in the tissues, like size of the tissue. Um, so this will give us an idea whether it's due more to, is it because of the lack of morphological adaptations? Yeah. Yeah. So there are ways to. So nowadays, there's also an increased interest in tendon strength, tendon stiffness, and stuff like that. And we do know that tendon stiffness does affect rate of force development. So with stiffer tendon, you will have high rate of force development to a certain extent. Yeah. So things like that may be affecting what we see with the athletes.
Very interesting. And when you look at, so I'm interested in like the metrics that you would select. 'Cause I know like there's sometimes it's a bit of a mess out there, and coaches are kind of a bit confused at which metrics to track long term. Do you have any specific metrics that you're really focused on monitoring?
Yeah. So personally, I do with isometric testing, peak force, relative peak force, and early force development. So like force at 50, 100, 150 milliseconds. Yeah. I don't really use rate of force development because it's less reliable as compared to the early force development. Because with early force development, it already gives us an idea of what the rate of force development would be. Yeah. So that's why I tend not to look at rate of force development. Yeah.
Yeah, so you tend to utilize the set time points, the
Yeah.
force at set time points. Have you ever looked at impulse at certain time
So
zones?
far, no.
No?
Yeah.
All right, I think we're getting close to the end.
Yep.
And do you have any topics that you would like to talk about or mention before we kind of wrap up?
Oh yeah. So recently there is a study there is a review that look at the effects of different training method on tendon stiffness. Right. So what they found was high resistance training, like eccentric, concentric, and isometric, have better effect than plyometric, which is fast stretch shortening cycle kind. So the author did mention that strain to the tendon is the key to improving tendon stiffness, and eccentric training. We do know that if we use high supramax eccentric training, that would probably give us the highest amount of loading and the highest amount of strain to the tendon. So that works, but I will still recommend the use of isometric training because not that I don't recommend heavy eccentric, but we do know that when we do supramax eccentric, tend to get a lot of muscle soreness, so we have to plan that properly. But on the other hand, with isometric maximal, even with maximal isometric contraction, the level of soreness and the risk of injury is still lower. So this is something that we can consider including to our overall training program, so that we can have greater adaptations for the tendon. Yeah, so that's something. Yeah, that's final thing I would like to say.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. Okay, well, thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom and thoughts about isometric testing and training.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
No worries.